Sorry, I shot for 11:20 and ended up with 11:26. I call that a win. As we get rolling, first thing first is I questions from the last couple weeks of things that we talked about, but you had questions about, or things that we skipped over, or were confusing, or anything like that. Anything at all? Okay. If you didn't grab a Bible yet, you'll probably want one for today. And we are again in Exodus chapter 21. We're going to be starting off with violence. Yeah, Exodus 21. Easiest way to kind of remember the overall structure of Exodus is 1 up through 20 is the narrative of the flight from Egypt, right? 20 is 10 commandments, and then 21 through 31 are the giving of the Mosaic law, and then 32 is the golden calf, and then 33 to however many chapters are in Exodus is the re-giving of the law and kind of the closing narrative. Which is foretaste of things to come. After we kind of brush through these, I promise this will go faster as we get into it. But as we kind of go through these sections at 21 through 31-ish, after we go through that stuff, what we're going to do is we're going to go and look at, I think it's 33, 34, because so last week I mentioned what happens is the chunk that we get now is the detailed extended version, right? So we get all of these sections which very conveniently kind of correspond to similar sections within these other ancient legal codes, Code of Hammurabi, Code of Ur-Nammu, Code of Ipit Ishtar, all of those. Lipit Ishtar, so, oh my goodness. But what happens is after the golden calf incident, then God reestablishes the covenant with the Hebrew people. So, the covenant was broken in the golden calf debacle. God reestablishes the covenant, and when God reestablishes the covenant, what God does is essentially goes back through this entire giving of the law and gives a quick summary of it, almost as like a reminder of saying, "Hey, you remember all that stuff? Well, let's just do a refresher." So that's what we're going to look at after we go through this. Okay, but first we're going to start with violence, as I said. I'm going to just so right now, your Bible's in front of you. If you would just kind of start reading through these. And so we're going to do 12 through verse 12 through verse 27, and then we get into the property section. But read through these, and then I am going to just quote a couple of relevant passages from these various other legal codes. So starting off, this is the Code of Ur-Nammu, so 2100 to 2050 BCE. If a man commits murder, that man must be killed. If a man commits a kidnapping, he has to be imprisoned and pay 15 shekels of silver. If a man is, not that one. Sorry, I'm cherry picking through these for ones that are specific to violence. If a man knocks out the eye of another man, he shall weigh out half a mina of silver. If a man has cut off another man's foot, he is to pay 10 shekels. If a man in the course of a scuffle smashed the limb of another man with a club, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. If someone severed the nose of another man with a copper knife, he shall pay 2/3 of a mina of silver. If a man knocks out a tooth of another man, he shall pay 2 shekels of silver. So this is Code of Ur-Nammu. The thing that we noticed when we were reading through it is that murder is the only case where execution is leveraged as a punishment. Seemingly, if you harm another body part of a person without actually killing them, there's a fine. Kidnapping, notice, carries a fine. Okay, Code of Lipit Ishtar doesn't quite deal as much. This is mainly property damage that we get from this section of the Code of Lipit Ishtar. However, it does deal with violence towards property. If a man rented an ox and injured the flesh in the nose ring, he shall pay 1/3 of its price. If a man rented an ox and damaged its eye, he shall pay 1/2 its price. If a man rented an ox and broke its horn, he shall pay 1/4 its price. If a man rented an ox and damaged its tail, he shall pay 1/4 its price. So, similar to damage to a human being, in the Code of Lipit Ishtar, injuring an animal carries a similar fine, a fee scale for it. But unfortunately, we don't have, there's not an extant section of the Code of Lipit Ishtar that deals with violence to human beings. Now we're going to skip over to Code of Hammurabi. And this section is titled Personal Injury, but again, violence. If a son strikes his father, they shall cut off his hand. If a man destroys the eye of another man, they shall destroy his eye. If he breaks another man's bone, they shall break his bone. If he destroys the eye of a plebeian, or breaks the bone of a plebeian, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. If he destroys the eye of a man's slave, or breaks a bone of a man's slave, he shall pay 1/2 his price. If a man knocks out the tooth of a man of his own rank, they shall knock out his tooth. If he knocks out the tooth of a plebeian, he shall pay 1/3 mina of silver. If a man has struck a free woman with child and has caused her to miscarry, he shall pay 10 shekels for her miscarriage. If that woman dies, his daughter shall be killed. If by a blow he has caused a plebeian's daughter to have a miscarriage, he shall pay 5 shekels of silver. If that woman has died, he shall pay 1/2 mina of silver. If he struck a freeman's female slave and has caused her to have a miscarriage, he shall pay 2 shekels of silver. If that female slave has died, he shall pay 1/3 mina of silver. Okay, so Code of Hammurabi, this is a good 300 years after the Code of Ur-Nammu. Suddenly, well, not suddenly, it's not sudden at all. But what we see now is that in the case of personal injury and personal violence, suddenly the code of lex talionis, right? Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, etc., enters into the legal consciousness. So whereas before in the Code of Ur-Nammu, it was a fine for a personal injury, suddenly there is this distinction that occurs wherein we have established classes of peoples, right? So the 3 classes of people seem to be, based on this reading, free people, mainly free men, plebeians, and then slaves. One of the questions that came up last week is, what is a plebeian? Okay. Generally speaking, again, this is somebody who's distinct from a free person insofar as that they are in some way financially beholden to a noble, right? This concept carries throughout human history, right? Villeins in the Middle Ages, probably a similar class of peoples. But again, the distinction here between at least freeman and a plebeian, right, is a freeman owns all of their things, whereas a plebeian might be working on the land of a freeman or a noble, or they might be in some other way indebted. And then we get the third class, which is slaves, which are property, seemingly, at least according to the legal code. And notice the degrees of punishment and how they vary based on these distinctions. So if you kill, or if you cut off the hand of a freeman, your hand gets cut off. If you cut off the hand of a plebeian, there's a fine. If you cut off the hand of a slave, there's less of a fine. But the distinction between plebeian and slave isn't just the cost. If you cut off the hand of a plebeian, they get the money. If you cut off the hand of a slave, their owner gets the money, right?
Where did a woman get into this?
Well, the only place that, at least in this section of the Code of Hammurabi, that a woman gets mentioned, of course, is if she's got a child. And again, we get similar distinctions. So if a woman is with child, she gets beaten and is caused to miscarry, it's 10 shekels for the, is the blood price of the child. For a plebeian, 5 shekels. For a female slave, 2 shekels. 10, 5, 2, okay? If the woman dies, the daughter of the offender is killed, okay? Code of Hammurabi. If it's a plebeian, it's a fine, 1/2 mina of silver, which where's Susan Rustful this morning? Okay. I think it was 50 shekels or something like that per mina. Yeah, because she looked it up. But for a female slave, it's 1/3 of a mina of silver for the woman's life, which theoretically is the value of that. Okay, again, we're not going to necessarily discuss this stuff, but I'm setting the context. Okay, so Code of Urnemu 2050 BCE, Code of Hammurabi 1700, something like that. I'll look at it again. 1700 BCE. Okay, so 300 years later. Now we're going to look at violence in Exodus, and this is a moving target, right? Dating the Exodus narrative is tough. The number I stick with, because it's the number I heard, was circa 1500 to 1200, somewhere in that ballpark, okay? So the important thing is that significant time has passed, right? So seemingly society has evolved. One thing that we haven't talked about, and which I might look into, is where are these Hebrew people coming from? What was their prior context? Slavery in Egypt, okay? So again, a little bit of geography here. What are the two ancient powers that Israel is sandwiched between? The east, Babylon, Assyria, and the west, Egypt, okay? So if we're thinking about the influences that make up, or that inform or contribute to Israel, potentially, those two will be in there. To this point, we've only looked at the influences coming from the east. That's because because we have these codes that exist. One thing I would be curious to look at and I'm bringing it up now because I'm realizing that I have a blind spot in my research, is I'm curious to see if we have any witness to perhaps the legal codes, or even just kind of a basic picture of what things looked like in Egypt. What we do know, based on our own biblical narrative, is that there was a very similar, perhaps, class structure, wherein Egypt especially, right, the pharaoh and the nobles might as well be divine with how they were viewed. But there's definitely a slave of others. And then somewhere in the middle, there's probably another stratification as well, maybe similar to what we see in the East. Anyways, I bring this up just because think about, again, where these influences are coming from. So these people have fled Egypt. They once were slaves, right? So when we read, again, like the Levitical, or the Mosaic law and the Levitical law, one of the phrases that you'll hear come up again, especially with regards to slavery, is, remember that you once were foreigners in a foreign land. Okay, you once were slaves in Egypt. This is a constant reminder that comes into this. Okay, let's talk about violence. So verse 12 of Exodus chapter 21. Whoever strikes a person mortally shall be put to death. Okay. Don't read too much into the gender-neutral language here. This is the NRSV. Probably was man, but because of the way that the NRSV modernizes language, the most recent versions of the NRSV have done the work of not neutralizing, but be creating gender-neutral language in lieu of male-centric language. But what we're focusing kind of on is the comparison of legal codes. So whoever strikes a person mortally shall be put to death. Okay. If it was not premeditated, but came about by an act of God, then I will appoint for you a place to which the killer may flee. But if someone willfully attacks and kills another by treachery, you shall take the killer from my altar for execution. So at the end of last week's class, we started talking about this, and the thing that came up, right, is this seemingly kind of convoluted process that occurs in figuring out the guilt of the person, whether this was a premeditated act that resulted in the death of another, or whether it was an accident, or right, an act of God. Okay. One thing that I want you to notice, I encourage you to notice, and continue to look and listen for, is when the divine presence gets named, gets called into these laws. And the reason I want us to do that is I kind of want us to think about why. Okay? Why in particular does the person of God, or at least the concept, the legal concept in this case of God, get involved in this?
What's the difference between this and an oath?
That's a really good question, Carolyn. So Carolyn asked, what's the difference between this and an oath? I would make the argument, and we're open as always for disagreement, but I would make the argument that in fact this is about making an oath. Okay? So a person is charged with murder, right? They flee to the altar because according to the law, that is the appointed place to which a killer may go as a means of seeking legal process, legal due process, right? Because again, what's likely to happen if someone is accused and or seen to be committing murder in a ancient society? What's most likely to happen?
The family of the murdered would come
and take vengeance. Yeah, absolutely. Especially if in your code it says if someone strikes a person mortally, they shall be put to death. Okay, they'd be justified according to legal code now. So in this case, the weight of proving innocence is not on the accuser; it is on the accused in this case. So they flee to the altar, which, similar to the game of tag, is the safe place. They can't be touched there, right? We talked last week about how this might be an origin for the concept of sanctuary. So the temple in this case was sanctuary. When at the table, when at the altar, when in this place of sanctuary, then we get the conversation around whether the killing was premeditated. What we get here is verse 14, but if someone willfully attacks and kills another by treachery, you shall take the killer from my altar for execution. So here's the piece that I would encourage you to imagine about, is what is the process in this society by which they determine intent? Could be. Perhaps, there is a making of oaths. I've kind of offered up silly scenarios before, right? Like Bob steals George's cow, comes before the magistrate, says, George stole my cow. George shows up in court and says, that was my cow in the first place, right? And then Bob calls in his family and says, no, that's Bob's cow. George calls in his family and says, no, that's George's cow, right? And then finally they make an oath perhaps and say, I swear on whatever my what do you give? Collateral. Whatever my collateral is, essentially, that this is my cow. There's a lot of things. Again, this is a totally made-up scenario, but I imagine it's not so dissimilar from how these things might have occurred. But again, notice that if you are a person without means or property, this is not, or people to guard your back, right? This isn't going to play out well for you. So this process favors those of means and those who are popular. Ultimately, the decision is going to be made by a judge, right? By a magistrate, perhaps by a Levitical priest in this case. This is important when we get into like the book of Judges, right? To understand that judges, or those who arbitrate between two parties, in the case of the judges in the book of Judges, it was often arbitrating between two tribes, right? Serve the very important role of, in this case, maintaining order, right? So you don't have necessarily vengeance killings, okay? But the reason I'm kind of bringing up this ambiguity is if you are accused of murder, you're going to have a pretty tough go of it to prove your innocence, right? And by and large, your ability to at least prove lack of intent is going to be a lot easier if you've got a lot of people who are on your side, right? When we go back to the Ten Commandments and we get this commandment that says, "Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord your God in vain," it seems to be saying the one thing you don't do is bring God into it. And we kind of sort of get a picture of why that is here, because God in this case, the sole role of the divine seems to be in providing sanctuary for the innocent, right? Or at least those who didn't actually mean to kill the person that they killed, okay? But if you take advantage of that, you now default on that loan, right? So, arguably, what that means is that if you lie in this circumstance, God's punishment is going to be heaped on you, and then comes the execution. So you've essentially you tried to double or nothing. Now you lose double, right? So not only are you going to get executed, but you have done the thing that you were not supposed to do according to the commandments of God. Does that kind of make sense? So this is something that I encourage us to look for as we go throughout. When the divine gets involved, it contributes extra risk to the judgment involved, if that makes sense. It steps it up a level. Okay, let's keep going. Whoever strikes father or mother shall be put to death. Ooh, I wrestled with my dad a lot when I was a kid. I was walking on a fine edge there, let me tell you, right? Does this line up with the Ten Commandments? What is the commandment? Thou shalt honor thy father and mother. Does it say anything about being killed if you don't follow through on that? So and again, let's think about this. What's going on here between the giving of the Ten Commandments and now this biblical legal code that we've got in the chapter following the giving of the Ten Commandments? Application. That's what's going on here. Application. So the Ten Commandments kind of exist, at least in our biblical setting, in the text in Exodus. It's kind of this, here is what we aim for. Here is the standard. Here's the foundation. But where laws get into trouble is the wrong word, but where lawyers become important is in the application and the interpretation of law. What we're seeing here is a society that perhaps walking with God is taking this commandment, thou shalt honor thy father and thy mother, and a much more severe punishment than we get in any of the prior legal codes, right? What happens in the Code of Hammurabi if you strike your father? You get your hand cut off. If you strike your father or your mother in this code, whole 9 yards. You get
I
put to
wonder
death.
if that means that they got to a point where just saying cut off your hand was not sufficient enough.
I don't know. Linda was wondering, perhaps there were enough sons striking their fathers that the punishment of losing a hand wasn't severe enough to enforce respect. That's a scenario. That's a scenario. And again, we have nothing. There is no more information here regarding kind of the thought behind this. But a really important distinction to make is asking the question, is this what God intends for humanity? In other words, is this the voice of the divine saying, if a son strikes his father, you kill the son? Some might say yes, right? Keep in mind, it's the Bible. The Bible says it. I believe it. Okay?
By the time we get the Ten Commandments, it refines it to honor.
But the Ten Commandments is a predecessor to this.
I know.
It's a chapter before. Yeah. Yes, and this is what I'm encouraging you to think about. It's easy for me to stand up here and throw my answers at you, but I want you to think about Ten Commandments is maybe intentionally vague, but leaves a lot of room for interpretation. What does honoring your father and your mother look like? Not killing them. Yeah, that's a good one. That's a place to start, Marlena.
Not to wrestle with them.
Probably not striking, right? We want to avoid that if possible. Yeah, what does dishonor look like, right? And especially, and this is another contextual piece that we are really going to struggle with, is the concept of honor, which is absolutely present in 31st or 35th century Hebrew culture. Jill.
In pre-1776 America, it meant that you didn't change your station.
Ah.
To honor your parents or to stay at that class level of what it is.
You don't get above them.
No.
Okay, so Jill is saying, sorry, I'm speaking for the stream again, that pre-1776 America, what honoring your father and mother meant was staying at your station, not elevating yourself above your parents. That's very helpful insight.
I can see them going, they just got out of Egypt and they're traveling 40, going, and the father is supposed to be the head of the family, right?
Yeah.
And the sons get anxious.
Yeah.
And want to do other things. I
Yeah.
can see this
being important. Yeah, so again, the son's trying to take over.
Yeah.
And this is, I mean, and again, there's so many layers of culture and context that are on this that we're not going to be able to fully do justice to. But this is another really important thing to think about, is that it's not just about emotions and family ties, it's about property as well. It's about inheritance, right? It's about guaranteeing that process of property being passed on from the father to the eldest son in a chain of succession, right? That's definitely factoring. It's a very good point, Carolyn.
And there's concept of honor killing in the
Absolutely.
other faith traditions.
So honor killings, what does that look like in other faith traditions? What's that about? Is anybody educated on that? Honor killings, yeah.
Well, my understanding has always been this: the humiliation of the family's honor.
Yep.
Is an attack on their name, their legacy.
Yeah.
And the idea that the children really are the future. I mean, resurrection, whatever. Right?
Yeah.
But the children are us in the future.
Absolutely.
And if they humiliate themselves, we have to kind of excise the cancer here.
Yeah.
And in doing so, we restore the place of our status of our family.
Yeah, and this is very foreign in a modern American context, but not necessarily as foreign as we think, right? So, sorry, and again, repeating for those who are listening via the stream, Paul named that honor killings are about restoring what was damaged or lost in the family's honor. A really important piece there, which sometimes involves excising the piece that is doing the wounding.
But it's why one of the uncles in an honor society, the uncle is the one who is to kill the daughter.
Yep.
To shame the family.
Yep. Yeah.
Sure.
Pivot a little bit. What did honoring your father and mother look like for you all? How did that play out in your upraising? Yeah, but what did respect look like, Jim? I'm sorry, I'm going to drill down a little bit here. What were the do's and the don'ts?
I was raised in the Army.
You were raised in okay, totally different.
Depends how old you were.
That's kind of why I'm asking, Carolyn. Carolyn said it depends how old you are, but kind of why I'm asking is I want to see a little bit of a spectrum of stuff. I'll start. It never occurred to me to hit my dad or my mother, right? But a big part of that is also I wasn't in an abusive family. I was in, at least for my experience, a very healthy, very loving, generous, family that was trying to do the best by their sons. Wasn't always perfect. right? It never is, but that was the foundation. So it never occurred to me to act out in violence against my parents. I perhaps did when I was an infant or a toddler, right? How many of us have had toddlers that smacked you in the face or, did that kind of thing? Maybe intentionally, maybe just out of pure angsty frustration with what's going on. So do you think they were killing the 4-year-old that slapped their mom? Probably not.
The
No.
2-year-old's gonna bite you.
2-year-old will bite once they get teeth. Yeah. Jim, go ahead.
In growing up in the 60s, where the Vietnam War, the civil rights, my father and I would have very heated discussion over the kitchen table. But we had sort of a ground rule that we were pounding on the issue and not the person. So we never made a personal attack.
Okay.
I never attacked him for being stupid. But you're really hitting the issue.
So Jim's describing that in his upbringing, you felt free to have really intense conversations with your dad. There was space for that, and
with total respect for.
Yeah, mutual respect seemingly in that process. That's a really good picture of how that happened, Linda.
Well, there's always the saying, you live in my house, you live by my rules.
Live in my house, live by my rules. I definitely touched the boundaries of that once or twice.
I think we all did.
Usually didn't get that one repeated to me, but maybe it brushed up against it a couple of times. Marlene.
At my house, respecting my mother was the thing. I could sass my father, but if I said one sass word to my mother, my dad would be all over me.
Okay, so he was the one inflicting. He was playing guard there. Jill.
It wasn't so much obedience, like there wasn't a whole bunch of that.
Yeah.
But it was definitely about you knew that you were upsetting someone and you didn't do it.
Yeah.
Like you just did it. That was unquestionable.
Yep. Absolutely. You just knew. You knew what you were supposed to do.
When you get the look.
Yeah.
Oh, I
Anybody else's parents giving the look? Yeah. My dad was the looker. Yeah, the look. Did you get the look? So you came from okay. Same with you, Jackie.
I never knew what I did wrong. Sometimes I just got hit because my dad would just say, I know you did such and such today. And I'm like, what was it?
Any shared experience there? Anybody come from that?
Sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Andy.
I guess my dad came from a farming environment.
Yeah.
So it was more the idea of working with him as a family, the family benefit. That was how you honored them.
Okay. Yeah, and I would say I had similar experiences. So Andy, you were saying that the honor was about doing your share of the labor, contributing. Yeah, and I would say that was definitely my upbringing as well too. And again, growing up on a farm, there was work to be done. I didn't really experience, I joke about, brushing the edge of what I was, of that. I didn't really experience that unless I wasn't willing to contribute, right? And that wasn't, in my scenario, that wasn't necessarily about physical punishment, but loss of privileges, right? Later on, they used motivation by payment as a means of encouragement. My father, however, had a very similar experience to what Dennis and Jackie talked about, which was, and it was mainly his mother was very much. This is the way that the world works. This is the right, capital R. These are the right things to do. And if you deviate from that, I'm going to make sure that you get back into the right? Which had created a lot of conflict, actually. I mean, my dad was the middle of 3. He had an older sister who was a perfect child, right? And he had a younger sister who turned out to be even more of a wild child than he was. But my dad left home at the age of 18, right? That was, he wanted to get out of that environment. His younger sister left home at the age of 16, right? But that influenced then how they raised us, which was, they never wanted to create that. And this is, and I'm not just bringing this up to, well, here, let me put it this way. Here's what I would also like us to think about. We are describing maybe, 80 years of variance here. No, less than that, right? I'm 40, so maybe 40 years of variance in child rearing. Certain things happened in the 60s and 70s. Dr. Spock wrote his wonderful book, which forever changed the way that parents raise their children. And even today, we witness a significant deviation from the norms of my era, right? So I watch how my brother raises my niece. There have been several times where I've said that my mom would not have stood for that, right? But my niece is a wonderful human being, in spite of my brother. No, my brother is an amazing, amazing parent to his daughter, but definitely a bit of a different parenting style than we grew up with. And again, my father had a different parenting style than he was raised with, and I would argue so on and so forth. Think about that same variance in this context, okay? Think about how this might have played out across generations. So here in the Mosaic Law, somewhere in the middle of the second millennia BCE, we have whoever strikes father or mother shall be put to death. 2 verses later, whoever curses father or mother shall be put to death. A fairly rigid and unforgiving interpretation of honor thy father and thy mother. Do you think that perhaps years after this, maybe even centuries after this, the practices of the community are different than what we see in Exodus 21? What do you think? Is there room for that?
Back then, now I'm sort of thinking faith traditions currently and what type of rules come into
Well, obviously things are different currently. I'm saying let's imagine that this comes about in 15th century BCE. By 12th century or 10th century, or let's say 8th century BCE, do you think perhaps that the application of this is different? Do you think that it varies?
Sure. I reflect about the fact that this is Semitic literature. This is the Semitic world. I think of today. I think of the difference between Iran and Saudi Arabia in their morality police.
Yep.
And it's negligible. It's a family battle because it is about parenting.
Yep.
Right. And the trajectory that those societies have taken versus, let's say, Israel, modern day Israel. There's a huge amount of variation there.
Yep.
They come really from the same roots.
Yep.
And so you'd have to say this is probably the central distinguishing thing among these faiths.
Yeah.
Is how to parent, how to keep order, how to keep structure, how to honor those people as they're aging and their children are becoming stronger than they are. So it's really really close to home here. That this thing that we have seemingly sort of abandoned in the last so many years. I mean, one of the, for instance, 70s. I'm looking at my sister over here and wondering what her memories are. She's 4 years younger than me, but I remember very, very much growing up in the Army. This thing of structure was everything until Vietnam was a terrible thing psychologically for people in the service, and because what was being uprooted was everything, practically, and so I grew up being shocked that people in the civilian world did not say sir or ma'am to every adult, or even not address a man with his rank.
Sure.
Okay. So that was the 60s for me.
Yeah.
And so there's been this cataclysmic shift, I would say, in the ideas about how we parent, at least in the West. And I think it has a lot to do with why don't have a good dialogue with people outside of Europe. Yeah, not even with Japanese.
Yeah.
But when you think of the modern world as North America, Europe, or whatever, the rest of the world is not really buying into what they're seeing we're doing as they see us disintegrating.
Oh, sure.
And I think along these particular lines, these very lines right here.
Okay.
So,
I'm in no way, I'm not going to be able to paraphrase.
no,
that.
no, no.
But I do want to kind of state your last statement there, which is that in 2022, taking a survey of the globe in parenting, there are significant distinctions, even amongst cultures that we get along with in a political world, you know. And in fact, we were hanging out with my friend who comes from a Japanese background yesterday, and not even necessarily talking about punishment, but just in terms of the relationship with the parents is significantly different than my relationship, you know, with my parents. And for Obi, it's normal. There's nothing wrong with that, right? Yeah. But arguably, those differences can create big rifts between cultures. Yeah, Jim.
Is there anything in here where instead of the parents or other people have been violated, that the faith community rejects a person out of the faith community?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. You're jumping ahead, Jim.
Okay,
But no, this is good. We'll get to that. So Jim asked a very important question, which is where we're going to head, which is, are there instances within the Mosaic and Levitical law where the faith community rejects somebody? Absolutely. That's the next section we're going to look at.
You know, I was thinking they didn't even have to go a few hundred years where the people in the family probably didn't go along with this thinking. I think there's probably a lot of family secrets where they didn't want the public to know
Sure.
their son
Sure.
back and forth, but
Sure.
they kept it quiet because they didn't want to see their kids. I would think they'd want to see their kids getting killed.
You just raised a very, very important point. In the application of this specific law, how does it get carried out? So, you're on the family farm, Brian strikes his dad. How do we move from Brian striking his dad to Brian getting executed from striking his dad? Depends totally on the relationship with the dad. So perhaps this law exists in the public consciousness, but at the end of the day, who's it up to how it gets applied? In this specific case,
I guess dad has to kill him, right?
it's up to the family. Well, we don't hear that. We don't know whose responsibility it is. All we get is this shall be put to death. So is there perhaps a space wherein each family deals with things how they're going to deal with things? Similar to what we just described when we talked about how we were raised. But a kind of very important difference here, and this is what I'm going to keep circling back on, is that these words exist in the legal code. Within our legal code, are there protections for the well-being of parents? Yeah. More importantly, arguably, are there protections for the well-being of children? What does that say about our society? I'm not necessarily asking that question right now. I want you to think about that question, right? How have those laws changed over time? So in a modern scenario, if a father strikes a son, there is an avenue by which Child Protective Services gets involved in that process, right? Again, there are a lot of things that you're relying on there, which is reporting of the incident, which is the family dynamics. I mean, if this is a case of ongoing abuse within that family, chances are nobody in that family is going to mention it, which is why we have things like mandatory reporters who, if they see a son or they see a child that comes into their classroom that's covered in bruises, now the state or the broader faith community, but in our case, the broader community gets involved in the protection of that child. So here's a very important thing in thinking about this. On whose side does the burden of or does the favor of the law rest in this picture? Very heavily in favor of the parents. In 2022, arguably, again, this is a debatable thing, whose side does the law tend to protect? Minors, children.
If you can get to law.
If you can get to law. But it's the same thing here, right? It's the same thing here, but again, the responsibility in this case lies in the hands of the parents, okay? If you were to poll the American populace and ask them if they felt that laws that protect the well-being of children are vital to our society, how do you think that poll would come out? Pretty high. I would say, with few exceptions, which would probably be religiously based, I think the vast majority of people in the United States would say that laws that protect the well-being of our children are vital to our functioning as a just society, okay? If you ask those same folks, if you polled those same folks, especially those who identify as being of the Christian faith, whether or not they believe that biblical law should be applied, what do you think you're going to get? I think you're going to get a much more nuanced, for lack of a better word, answer. So here's a really good question. If we as a society are convinced that we should be caring for and protecting our children, even so far that our legal system is biased on behalf of the child, right? And again, the mechanisms by which things get reported, there are many things in here. But if that's the way that we would argue the world is supposed to look, okay, but our holy book has this in it, how do we as Christians work with that? Okay? I don't have an easy answer for us.
What about the 15-year-old that just killed his father and mother?
What about the 15-year-old that just killed his father and the mother? Or the 17-year-old that crashed his car and his mother's body was in the trunk? I mean, again, this is the really tough part about dealing with this. Not with this, but with law in general, is that there is no perfect, right? Every time you're going to run into asterisk, but in this case, perhaps different, right?
I have another question.
Okay.
It says, honor whoever strikes father or mother. Suppose there's no father. Like we had our father deceased when she was 11 and I was 14.
But Carolyn, there is a law for that. So Carolyn said, whoever strikes father or mother, but what if there's no father? There's always going to be a father, at least according to the law, because later on, once we get into Leviticus, it makes rules for that, which is that if a man dies, if a husband dies, it's the family's responsibility to marry that widow to the next son, so that when she has a child, right, then, they're taken care of. But if the woman already has children, in that case, she now is essentially taken care of by the family, okay? So there's going to be a male figure around somewhere that he can slap and get killed for, right? That's built into it. You have no fear. Marlena.
You mentioned that today's laws to protect our children and that sort of thing is the idea is to search for a just society.
Yes.
Okay, so was these to search for a just society?
That's a really good question, Marlena. So Marlena says, in today's world, right, our laws, especially the ones that protect the well-being of children, are because we are aiming to be a more just society. Marlena asked the question, did those same motivations exist in this legal document, in the minds of the people who were there? Did they search for a more just society? I think so. I think absolutely. In fact, I would hope so. Otherwise, I would potentially lose faith in the human race as a whole, which is day to day at this point. But I'm sorry, I'm being snarky. I'm not that cynical. Week to week, month to month, maybe. But yeah, I would think so. But again, a really important thing, which I'm maybe beating a dead horse here to a certain extent, is what did just mean? right? What was their concept of what justice looked like? Who needed to be protected by the law, right? One of the things that I mentioned in the sermon, which is so important, is that in this legal code and in following, the three categories that the law specifically protects are widows, orphans, and strangers. Because that society is trying to be more just. And because those are three categories of people who are not protected in that culture, right? In fact, I would argue out of those three, being a foreigner is probably the scariest, right? That's taking your life into your own hands. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah, right there. The Levite and his concubine. These are perfect examples of what happens. The most awful stories in our scripture are when a stranger goes into a strange land. Okay. But widow, orphan, stranger, this is the stuff that throughout the story of Israel is pointed at as saying, the widow and the orphan were not protected, the stranger was abused. We exploited our poor. To paraphrase Amos, our thrones are built on the backs of the oppressed, right? Sorry, I'm really getting off on a tangent here, and I haven't even gotten through a quarter of this, but this is the thinking that I want us to yeah. Andy, go, sorry.
It seems like the role or the understanding of what a victim is also changing.
Yeah. Okay, so the role or the understanding of what a victim is. Say more.
Well, just that in that code that you're reading, it really wasn't there to understand what a victim was.
Yeah.
In other words, there was no discussion of why the son or daughter strike the parent.
Yep.
There's no discussion about that. Where now, that is an issue.
Absolutely. Motive. The underlying circumstances are so important in how we talk about, laws and legal precedent in our modern culture. That there's no space for that here. The only space where that might exist, again, is within potentially the family unit itself, right? So son strikes his father. It's kind of up to that family of how they're going to apply the precedent that exists. And again, perhaps this is a family where they're like, well, Jacob was being a jerk and he should not have hit his dad, but his dad was being a jerk too, and so we're going to let this slide. Perhaps that happens more often than not. But again, the law falls solidly on the side of the parent in this. Paul, you're chewing on something.
Well, yeah, because last 18 years I've worked at a place where every day, imagine this, every day in a process group at 10 o'clock in the morning, I have asked men successively to share the music that is most important to them. Vile as it is, often truly vile. And they do so. The number one song, the litany of the lives of felons in Portland, Oregon. Number one song over the 18 years. Still today. It was when I got there 18 years ago. So is Johnny Cash's Boy Named Sue.
Oof.
Right?
Wow.
So yeah, and so their idea of justice is to slap around the women till they get in line.
Yeah.
Slap around the kids till they get in line. And that's how I'm doing them a favor, because that's the way the world works.
Huh.
And everything else is bullshit.
Huh.
Okay. So I look at that and I say, this is, I'm just going to be a little political.
No, that's all right. That's all right.
This is the core, undisputed belief, I believe, of what Donald Trump represents. He is an abusive father, and the country is so out of line that it needs an ass kick. And he's the only one who can do it. And these stupid liberal Democrats can't possibly understand what the world is about. And that's just foundational. That's foundational to black men, white men, Hispanic men, Asian gang members, you name it. It's like they don't know another word for justice. Justice is only established because the police are a bigger, badder gang than we are. They just have more weapons. But heck, we're arming ourselves, and and we're going to take them on. And God will decide who's going to win that one. And we've got this whole thing going on. It's not just an undercurrent right now. It's really a pathetic reality in America that we have this misunderstanding of parental authority, right? But it's PTSD based.
Sure.
Okay, it's just the traumatizing of the children is coming to roost in ways
The
that
sins of the father are transmitted to the second and third generations. Yeah.
And it is about parenting.
And this is something that we talked about last week as well, or potentially it was the week before though. Is again the common thread that runs through this that we constantly need to be thinking about is that just because this is 3,500 years in hindsight doesn't mean that we are 3,500 years separated from these concepts, and not necessarily disagreeing, but wherever we see this manifest, right, it's maybe coming from common motivations. Because we've heard that language as well too, is that, how do I say this? Is that when we talk about returning to good times, has often been equated with returning to Bible-based education, Bible-based parenting, Bible-based family stuff. Here it is.
There it is.
Here's Bible-based.
Right.
So Dennis, go. I'll stop preaching. Sorry.
I just want to say two things.
Go.
First, I want to you said something during your sermon
Okay.
today that meant a lot to me, which at these times that are so troubled, and that is we're always going to have trouble.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure.
And so we shouldn't. And I took from that, so we shouldn't give up hope.
Absolutely.
And I thank you for that. The other thing is, what I don't quite understand dwelling on these laws. So Jesus said he did not come to abolish the laws, but to fulfill them.
Absolutely.
But also, I took from that also fulfill them in terms of God's wishes, and that people that fall back on the Old Testament to justify actions that are not justified by the teaching of Christ.
Absolutely.
And
You are describing a really good path for how and I would say from a mainline Protestant perspective, right? How we have navigated this. One of the things that I struggle with as a preacher, right, is that Luther said, the Bible is the cradle that holds the Christ child. And Luther was relatively insistent that some books were better than others. Namely that where you encounter the clearest picture of Christ is in the gospel narrative. And then maybe some of Paul's letters, depending on which ones you pick. Right? James, straight out, that's not Paul, but And so from a mainline Protestant perspective, the Jesus saying, I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, is a really great place for us to move from in how we can perhaps even justify this progression of humanity that we're witnessing, which is continuing to advocate justice for the oppressed, continuing to try to do better with those within our systems who are vulnerable, like children in abusive homes, continuing to stand up for the widows, the orphans, and the foreigners in our context. One thing that's also very important to me as a preacher is that I am able to read these words, which are just as much part of our holy book as the gospel narratives are. No, keeping in mind that as a Lutheran, and as me personally, if you make me choose between Exodus and Luke, I'm going to choose Luke 100 times out of 100, right? But I personally strongly believe that it's my responsibility, and maybe it's just my responsibility as somebody who preaches and teaches Scripture, to be able to go into the book of Exodus, see the ugliness that exists there, and not necessarily have an explanation for it. I mean, that's kind of what we're doing in this conversation, is we're looking at these other legal codes and we're saying, well, this is just how the world worked at that day and time, right? But does not excuse necessarily the fact that that's part of our canon, right? But it's there. So I feel it's my responsibility to at least be able to say with some confidence, this stuff is part of our canon. And I do not believe that in any way, shape, or form we should desire to return to this model of the world. Okay?
We should learn from it.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. We should learn from it, right? We're awful at learning from things that happened before us. But I have to be able to acknowledge that it exists. Because where this leads me eventually is it leads me to confronting how I functionally treat Scripture. And this, I think, this ultimately, for me personally, is the conversation that we, at least within Christianity, whatever that means in 2022, really need to be having. And I hate to say it, but even maybe drawing lines in, is how does the Bible function in our faith? Are we, who as Lutherans, claim we're seeking to discover the face of God in Scripture, and there are some books where we see that face more clearly, or are we, again, using phrases like the Bible says it, I believe it, I take the Bible literally, I am going to pick and choose and apply, and I shouldn't say pick and choose, but I am going to turn back to laws that were written 2,500 years ago as justification for my prejudices, is that I feel like that we need to have a conversation about which one of those perspectives is faithful interpretation of Scripture, and which one is using a 3,000-year-old historical document as justification for our current bigotries or prejudices. Again, I don't know that we're going to be able to have this conversation with in and amongst Christianity, but I really think that it's important that we have it here at least, right? And okay, 11:30. I'm coming from a different place, right? I'm 20 to 40 years younger than most of you in this room. I was raised in a specific part of Michigan, which was Norwegian socialists, believe it or not. And so my family situation, my religious situation was, and I've mentioned this before, and it probably comes as no surprise, the totality of my family were farm labor Democrats. So this influences how I understand the world, how my politics function, but also, believe it or not, how I read Scripture. But one of the things that's consistent through my upbringing is that both sides of my family were Orthodox Lutherans, whatever that meant to them in their context. And my grandparents that are surviving continue to be people of great faith, even though my grandma can't make it to church anymore. She now watches church on her iPad, and my grandpa comes when I come, right? Okay, I'm running off course here. But anyways, what I mean to say is that this is part of why I see the Bible this way is because that's my faith tradition. And so I also have to be careful not to demonize those who come from a very different faith background and who see the Bible as a different way, but does not diminish the need to have conversations about the scary stuff that's in here.
If it's infallible and inerrant.
Yeah.
Half or more of our Christian family members
Protestant family members.
Mm-hmm.
We have to be able to talk with them about a different approach to the Bible. I mean, if they want to
Absolutely.
know why that is.
Absolutely. Okay, it's 11:32 and I've gone past time. I just want to close with one verse. We're jumping ahead a little bit. We'll come to this eventually. We didn't get through all of violence today, shockingly. But here are two verses. Well, it's a little bit more. Verse 21 in chapter 22. You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you are aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall not abuse any widow or orphan. If you do abuse them, when they cry out to me, I will surely heed their cry. My wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children orphans. This is in the same section that we just got finished with. And I told you at the beginning, pay attention to when the divine voice gets involved. Pay attention. Where does the divine voice get involved? Where does God's agency seem to manifest? Okay? And again, it might seem like we spent this last hour just totally delegitimizing the Mosaic Law, which in some ways we did, let's be honest. But, and I want to be really careful, this is not necessarily saying, well, but there's good stuff in there too. But there is good stuff in there too, right? There is the voice of the divine managed to speak out of this document that's 3,500 years old, and those are the things that I want to pay attention to, right? Out of all of this stuff, where do we hear explicitly the voice of God saying, this stuff's, I'm not going to use the word good, but it exists. Here's the things that I want you as a society to remember and focus on. These are the people that I care about. Now, it would have been much more convenient if God said, slaves are bad, you shouldn't beat your kids, or wives. Wives should be as equal in your societal economic construction as men are. There should be much more room for your understanding of gender and sexuality. I mean, it would be great if that was the Mosaic Law, but it's not. But we got verse 21. All right, well, go ahead, Andy, and then we'll close.
But there are hints in the Mosaic Law and in precedent that show that.
Yes.
One of which is the Ten Commandments, who gets killed?
Yes. Nobody.
Women, oppressed people, no power, except Shabbat.
Yes.
You cannot have a Seder unless the elder woman
Yes.
starts the whole thing off.
Yes.
So that's exceedingly powerful.
And if I were to summarize it, human beings manage to be just in spite of our laws sometimes. So that's what we'll leave it today. But thank you for that. And we're actually going to look at, that's the next piece we're going to look at, is Jubilee and Sabbath law, because that is the point at which we get the voice of God speaking really firmly. All right, folks.